Dave.
Yeah, sure. So, hey, my name's Know0thing. I'm a entrepreneur. I'm 22. On my stream, I like just debating people and going on debate panels. That's pretty much all I do streaming wise because I'm pretty busy otherwise. And yeah, I like talking philosophy, politics, economics, life, all the good stuff. And my political identity is pretty fluid at the moment, which is why I like doing these debates. I get to learn new things and change my mind. But right now, if you ask me, I'd identify as a social democrat.
Okay. Um, yeah, sounds good. Um, I can't remember how exactly we came to be having this conversation. I think you posted something on Twitter, which I responded to. I said, like, debate me or something, and then we just sort of DM'd about it. Um, so I guess the conversation, like, vaguely that we were planning on having was a conversation about communism and a conversation about capitalism. So I guess first of all, just like if you don't mind, like explain your position on capitalism and communism, and where you object to my views. Obviously, me being a communist and so on. If you want to like start us out with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing I've learned from debates is I don't want to assume too much about what I disagree with you with because every communist, every social democrat has their own views of what that means to them. So
Mm-hmm.
for that part, I'll wait till I hear your side. But from my perspective, at least, capitalism is the best engine that society has ever discovered or invented in creating a vast amounts of wealth and enriching society. But it comes with numerous problems that a government has to address, such as insane income inequality, a very uneven distribution of wealth, too much power in politics by the people at the top, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't have a strong enough social safety net, which we could easily afford in most developed countries. So that's really where I see the role of government in getting this big pie distributed in as a fair and equitable way as possible. But I just fundamentally believe in private property and trading as the best way to develop wealth, and it is the freest way. Freedom isn't the only thing I care about, but it's something I care about, and to me, it would seem a lot of freedom is lost under communism, along with a lot of wealth.
Sure. So I guess I'll just sort of explain my opinion and then go over, I guess, where I disagree with what you said. Um, like I said, I'm a communist. Communism to me is just constituted by workers' collective democratic workers' control over the means of production, rather than private hierarchical capitalist control over the means of production, and production for the sake of the direct use of society rather than production for the sake of exchange on a market for profit. I like those are the two elements that sort of constitute communism for me. And I guess so where I disagree with the things that you said. So you said that capitalism, is the best tool that we've found historically for, creating a lot of wealth. If the argument is that capitalism was a massive productive boom to society, as compared to its predecessors, which was, feudal society and slave society, those sorts of economic forms of organization. Certainly that's true. Nobody's going to deny that. I certainly wouldn't deny that, and nor would Marx. Marx talked extensively about how capitalism was a massive boom as opposed to, what came before it. But I think the real question is whether we would be better off with, not whether or not capitalism was better than feudalism and slave society, but whether or not we would be better off in terms of utility adopting a communist system as opposed to our capitalist system. And I don't see any reason why communism would necessarily prohibit the production of wealth that you talk about. I certainly don't think that it's would be deductively valid to say that because capitalism was more productive than what came before it, that therefore it's more productive and preferable to communism. I don't think that's like a deductively valid line of reasoning. And when it comes to freedom, because that's the other thing, you sort of talked about how capitalism produces more wealth and it produces more freedom. I would be inclined to think that that isn't true. So when I think of freedom, I think of the extent to which people have control over their lives to consciously guide their lives towards their own desired ends. And I think that capitalism prohibits people's ability to do this in a lot of ways. I mean, most people spend most of their lives in a capitalist economy at a business which is structured essentially as a private dictatorship, where they have a boss watching over everything they do, deciding when they get to use the bathroom and when they get to have a lunch break or a smoke break and so on. I think the fundamental structure of the enterprise under capitalism, in addition to how it, distributes wealth and so on, there's a lot of things about capitalism, I believe, that fundamentally inhibit the ability of people to guide their own lives towards their own self-desired ends, which I think is like the core of freedom. And I think that communism would allow people to do that to a much greater extent, which is part of why I advocate for it. Yeah, so I just wanted to get to the part about social democracy as opposed to, because I think that's important, and then I'll shut up and kick it off to you. But when it comes to people who say, like, well, yes, capitalism births some negative externalities like inequality and so on, but we should just combat that through like regulation and government intervention and so on, there's like a few points that I would make to that. So for one, I think that you're never going to solve all of the critiques that Marxists levy against capitalism through state intervention. For example, one of the criticisms I levy is that if capitalism is just fundamentally undemocratic based on the business structure, that is fundamental to capitalism, and you're not going to change that without getting rid of capitalism completely. Another critique we levy is alienation. Again, this is fundamental to the structure of capitalism. And another thing is like instability, which is everywhere capitalism's ever existed. There's been a downturn every 4 to 7 years. That's never been overcome in any capitalist society. So I think a lot of the critiques we make are intrinsic and cannot be dealt with through government regulation. And even if you can deal with some through government regulation, we've seen throughout the history of social democracy that if you leave the core mechanisms of capitalism intact, it will, rebirth itself. Sort of like, take, for example, the New Deal. We established the New Deal, and then in the following decades, capitalists infiltrated the government and used bribes to systematically repeal that New Deal. And we've seen similar trends across the social democratic societies in Scandinavia and so on. So I would say, one, you can't get over the core issues of capitalism with government regulation. You can just get rid of some of its externalities. Two, even the externalities you are able to do away with, I don't think that's going to last, because capitalism fundamentally has this corrosive element which does away with regulations that impede businesses' profitability. And three, even if you could do away with all of the negative externalities of capitalism, it would still necessarily be preferable to have a society which doesn't birth these negative externalities, which we then have to spend so much energy combating in the first place, which obviously a communist society would not. So yeah, I know, I'm sorry that was a lot. We can do it one by one, or you can respond to all that if you want. But yeah, I'll kick it back to you now.
Yeah, definitely made some good points, but that was a lot to keep in my mind at once. So I'm going to let's just talk one at a time at these critiques.
Yeah, for sure.
So I guess the most recent thing you critiqued was that, like, no matter what the state does, there are things intrinsic to capitalism that no state can like solve, and no matter what you do, as long as you have capitalism instead of like socialism or communism, you're going to have these problems. Like, it's undemocratic, there's alienation, and any reforms you do get through are eventually going to be overturned. Mm-hmm. Like, is that a fair understanding of your point?
Yeah, that was one of the main points I made.
Yeah, I know you made other points. I'm just trying to do one at a time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I guess let's delve down deeper into those ones, such as like alienation. Like, I hear this a lot from like communists about how like capitalism intrinsically alienates people and they don't enjoy their work, and they just would much prefer some communist system. But I guess empirically, I just don't think we see that. Like, most people won't even vote for a social democrat and Bernie Sanders. That's how unalienated with their work they are. They're pretty satisfied with how they're doing right now, and they know that in general, every generation is being better off than the generation before that. So I'm like, do you have any, like, I know a lot of the analysis is like psychological about why you'll be alienated, but is there any empirical evidence that this alienation is taking place?
I mean, yeah. So a couple of points. So for one, I mean, there's been one of the things that Marxists critique about alienation is the idea that in any workplace, the workers are fundamentally, like, their lives are controlled by capitalists to an absurd extent. And there's been a lot of empirical evidence that I can pull up for you that says that, lots of workers suffer mental illness for fear of being, like, let go and so on, because obviously they don't have any participation in the workplace that they work at. There's just been other evidence showing that the greater extent to which someone has control over their own lives, the more happy they are. And obviously, if your workplace is controlled by someone other than you and you don't have any power over what goes on at the place you spend most of your life at, that's going to inhibit your ability to control your own life, obviously. As far as the idea that, most people aren't in favor of socialism, and that sort of indicates that they don't feel alienated, I would disagree with that. I don't think that the fact that most people aren't in favor of communism implies that they aren't being negatively impacted by capitalism. I just think that implies that the propaganda network has done a really good job at, keeping people from drifting too close towards ideological tendencies which aren't favored by the prevailing capitalist institutions. I mean, Noam Chomsky talks a lot about this, and for example, Manufacturing Consent, where he talks about, how throughout history capitalists have sort of used the media to push narratives conducive towards their goals and so on.
Okay, yeah.
Talked about this as well, with his
I'll
theory
stop
of
you right there
ideology.
because
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with what you're saying. Actually, you've changed my mind a bit on this. So yeah, I'm willing to accept that. Like, I'm not going to say there necessarily is a ton of alienation, but that I haven't levied a good argument against alienation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think you countered that pretty well.
Sure.
So yeah. So like, let's assume that there is alienation. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a bad thing, but the question is, can we make it better? Right? Like, would communism actually work? So, like,
Yeah.
I guess, can we get to that for a second? I know this is a bit off topic, but
Yeah,
it's part of the
absolutely.
main topic.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so, like, my worry is that, like, as I was saying before, capitalism produces a ton of wealth, and that's mostly because of the fact that people are able to freely trade their items and make deals that mutually benefit both sides, right? You're only going to trade $20 for a meal if you think the meal is more valuable than $20 to you, and the person you're giving the $20 to thinks that $20 is more valuable than the meal.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the more trades you make, basically the more value is created. And the only way you can make trades is if you have private property that you're capable of trading. So, like, I just don't. And the other thing I worry about a lot is, my understanding would be, would there be mandatory work under communism? Because then I could see the same alienation taking place. And if there is no mandatory work, then what is people's incentive going to be to actually work to improve society and produce wealth?
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of things there to go over. So first of all, the point about would there be forced work under communism? No. Well, I'm a Marxist, so yeah, no, would be my answer to that, because, Marx wrote a lot about how, under communism, everything is like, it's the voluntary free association of producers. Obviously, in a communist society that Marx talked about and that I advocate for, nobody's going to be forced to work. And your point about, if you're not forced to work through, the threat of, like, poverty or starvation or whatever, why would what incentive would you have to work? So my argument against that would be like money and profit is like one incentive to work, right? That's the incentive capitalism offers, but it's not the only incentive. For example, there are other incentives related
Oh no, I
to
won't argue it's the only incentive.
yeah,
I'd
yeah,
argue that it's the major incentive.
yeah. So sure, it is the main incentive like under capitalism, but at the same time, under capitalism, it's one of the crucial incentives, but it's also an incentive which sort of suppresses other incentives. You know, if the whole society is focused around like maximizing money and maximizing profit, obviously people are going to have it less in the forefront of their mind that, hey, I should go do this because it betters the community or because I just want to do this. Or, you know, I enjoy labor and so on. But I think in the absence of the profit incentive, we have no reason to think there would just be a net reduction in the overall incentive to do these things, because while at the same time, yes, there's no more profit incentive, that just means that the profit incentive wouldn't be suppressing other incentives as it does in our current capitalist society, and therefore other incentives would be more prevalent. For example, people choosing to do things for the community or for their own, you know, personal pleasure. There's been a lot of studies showing that when people aren't like able to work, they, you know, become depressed and suicide rates skyrocket and so on, even if they are receiving like unemployment benefits. And I think that's fundamentally because people need shit to do. And that's, you know, Marx talked about this as well. And so I don't think that in the absence of a profit motive and in the absence of money, everyone would just like stop working to any extent that would be harmful to society. And the final point, I guess, would be, as far as your argument about, you know, people like trading with each other and it's like a voluntary, beneficial transaction. So I agree to an extent, but I don't think communism would do away with the ability for societies and even people to exchange things like technically, right? It would just take like a fundamentally different form, because exchange wouldn't take the form of generalized like commodity production. For example, one of the things that a lot of communists advocate for is this idea of like mutual aid, where different societies sort of come together in federations or groupings. Different like communist societies could come together and sort of engage in this process of mutual aid, where, you know, one group helps another group with resources and so on, and they help them. And just sort of like network, like anarchists and communists have long advocated for these sorts of structures. So I don't think that, I think that just goes to show that like doing away with capitalism doesn't necessarily do away with the ability for humans to engage in mutually beneficial transactions.
Okay, well, so you'll get some of these trades, but it will be a lot less common, because if I don't own anything, I can't trade anything. Like if I have 2 pies of pizza and someone else has soup, and I like pizza, they like pizza, I like soup. Is the pizza mine to go sell to them, and then I can use that money to buy soup? I wouldn't think so, because there's no money or really trading, because it's not my pizza in a sense, because I don't own anything in communism. Am I correct?
So you're partly correct in the sense that, sorry, I just knocked my headphones out. It is correct that under communism there would be no money, so you wouldn't be able to like sell a pizza and then go out and buy a soup. But that doesn't mean it's true that you can't own anything. So like, for example, Marxists generally make a distinction between personal and private property, where like, personal property can be things like, you know, my microphone or a TV or a desk or something that a person can like personally own. And that's not what Marxists are trying to abolish. Marxists are trying to abolish private property, which refers to like the means of production, like factories and so on, that are used to like produce things in society. But as far as the idea that there would be less exchange, um, I'm sort of trying to understand where you're coming from here, because it seems to me that like yes, in a communist society, there wouldn't be like market exchange, right? In the sense that there wouldn't be someone selling something to someone else. But that doesn't mean that, like, I guess to get a little bit closer to the core of your argument, like, what do you think the benefit of this mutually voluntary like trade is? Like, what is the benefit of that? Because what I'm saying is that while it is true that you wouldn't have like the same market exchange, I don't think you would be losing out on any benefits that you could get from, say, like a democratically planned economy where consumers could, make their voices heard and get the things they want and so on.
Okay, so what trying to argue at least is that every trade you make creates value because both people get more value after the trade than they had before that trade. So basically, the more trades you have, the more value is created by society. And it's the coolest type of value in a sense because you don't actually need to work to produce anything. All you have to do is exchange two goods or exchange money that will then be used to buy another good that you otherwise didn't have because everybody values things in different manners, right? So like in one sense in capitalism, I want as many trades as possible because the more trades, the more value everybody has.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah, okay. So I get the idea of like trade is good because obviously if someone wants something more than something else, them getting the thing that they want more creates more value for them than if they weren't able to trade that thing for something they want more. Um, but I don't see how you couldn't get the same effects from, say, a democratically planned economy where workers councils say put in like proposals for the things that I'm not proposing any specific model. I'm just giving you examples of what some Marxist and anarchist and communist academics have like proposed to give you an idea of how things could work without markets or whatever. But say like there's a system wherein like workers councils submit proposals for what they want to produce, and then consumer councils submit proposals for what they want to consume, and then this sort of negotiation process takes place. You're still getting a scenario wherein there is negotiation between people to facilitate the distribution of things to people that want those things. So, like, I don't think that trade, like market exchange, is the only way to distribute things to people who value them. It's just one mechanism of doing so. But I think it's a mechanism which comes with a lot of other harmful externalities, which we don't need to allow in order to get the effect of what you're talking about.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and that like in a utopian type communist system, like somehow like they would be able to figure out exactly the optimal way to produce and distribute resources. But I just don't see how anybody's getting that information. The way the market finds that information is through trades and prices, where if this thing is $5 and nobody values it at $5, you're going to lower the price because you're going to have an oversupply, and vice versa if you get an undersupply. Like it's a very dynamic way to distribute resources, where this method coming from the top down instead of the bottom up, I just don't see how you're going to be able to get all the relevant information to actually be able to do an efficient distribution versus they're going to be inevitably many, many inefficiencies and that people would have more value to them in the capitalist system.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point because that does get to like the core of what I was trying to get across. Is Yeah, so you posit the idea that, say, capitalism distributes things to people who value it through trade, and you're skeptical of the idea that a communist society would also be able to do that. Um, and that's understandable, but I think there have been proposals and plausible ways suggested of how consumer demand could be taken into account and met by a planned economy. So, for example, I'll give you like two different ways in which this has been proposed. So, like Michael Albert, who is a far left economist, has suggested this idea of, sort of what I was alluding to earlier, where workers' councils submit proposals for what they want to produce. Consumer councils submit proposals for what they're going to want to consume in like the upcoming few weeks or so. And then this sort of goes to like an iterative facilitation board, and like, these things are sort of adjusted, and there's a process of like negotiation between worker and consumers councils until a plan is met, which is agreed upon, and so on. And then Paul Cockshott alternatively like proposes a model of planning where like there's a board which sets like how many like labor vouchers or whatever, which isn't the same as money but is still used for some leftists still advocate for labor vouchers to be used as a method of gauging consumer demand. So like, sorry, I got a bit off track, but Paul Cockshott has advocated for labor vouchers where like people buy things with labor vouchers, and then as like a facilitation board or something like takes into account how many people are spending their labor vouchers on this product or that product, and then adjusts how much labor vouchers it takes to get that product like accordingly with reference to the amount of labor it took to make that commodity. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I don't agree with like Paul Cockshott on a lot of things, but I'm just giving you like sort of examples of how historically there have been proposed plausible methods of taking into account consumer demand in a communist economy. So I don't think it's like I don't think it would be impossible or even hard to have the effect you're talking about under communism.
Okay, well, like when you go to these like different ideas of how to do it, one major thing is like there are societies that have tried to put these into tests, and as far as I'm aware, they pretty much fail every time, and like out competing capitalist societies in producing wealth and happy people. Like there have been many societies throughout history that have attempted planned economies and failed. So like are these like new ideas that like North Korea and Soviet Union just like hadn't heard of yet and haven't tried yet, and like could maybe we could test this out in one of these countries first, because like I'm very skeptical that this would be nearly as efficient.
Yeah, so as far as like the Soviet Union, yeah, the Soviet Union existed a while ago, and they were using technologies for taking into account labor values for various commodities, which are obviously vastly outdated and inefficient compared to today's standards. But yeah, so no doubt there have been communist countries which have, well, not communist by my definition, but like self-proclaimed communist countries that have tried planning and it hasn't, worked out so well. But this is because of a variety of factors, I think. So, for example, a lot of these countries didn't or don't have access to the sort of technology which I think is in large part required to rationally plan an economy. A lot of these countries, like, for example, Venezuela, just suffered from, like corruption issues in the government, which had, nothing to do with its economy. I think Paul Cockshott has like a breakdown of the specific economic policies that caused countries like Venezuela and the Soviet Union to collapse. So a lot of this has to do with like the specific policies of the specific countries, the fact that a lot of these places have been met by the capitalist imperialist world with heavy embargoes and like economic sanctions and so on. For example, that the U.S. did that to Venezuela and did it to North Korea and to Cuba. So yeah, I think there's a variety of things that you have to take into account, from the technology to the interference to the corruption in the government to the specific policies of these countries. There's all these things that you have to take into account. So I think it would be hasty to draw, based on these historical examples, the conclusion that a communist planned economy is just like economically not feasible, I guess.
Oh no, I'm not saying it's not feasible. I'm saying that every time there's a new communist country that attempts this and attempts centrally planning, you will have an opportunity to see, will it work this time? And if it works, that's like evidence that communism would be successful. And if it doesn't work, that'd be evidence that there are some maybe perhaps inherent flaws in it. And I'm just saying that, like, if every time it hasn't been successful, that just is a lot of evidence for it possibly being inherent flaws to it, rather than just bad policies and corruption. But it doesn't necessarily imply that. It's just evidence that leads me to believe it's likely.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And yeah, and the other thing is, you're talking about how they didn't have like the technology yet. I mean, why doesn't North Korea like have the technology yet? They're pretty technologically advanced. Like, if the technology exists now, you would think that a country like North Korea would possess it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on with North Korea specifically. Like, for example, North Korea is like has heavy embargoes on it from like the US. A lot of our technology doesn't even reach North Korea. North Korea is spending most of their economic resources developing like nuclear programs and stuff like that to sort of try to ward off Western imperialism. But I like to get to the broader point. I generally agree with you that like in a vacuum, if you just take like, say a bunch of countries just like try communism and it doesn't work any of the times, or it's not achieved any of the times, which is, I guess, how I would prefer to phrase it.
Gotcha.
That would sort of imply like it would sort of give me the knee-jerk reaction to hypothesize that, okay, well, maybe communism is just inherently flawed. But I wouldn't be satisfied by just drawing a conclusion based on my knee-jerk reaction to the data. I would say this requires a more, serious, in-depth historical analysis. And when you do that sort of more in-depth historical analysis, you find that the issues which attempts at, planned communist economies have faced historically are largely not intrinsic issues which indicate any intrinsic flaws with communism. Like I said, when it comes to like the economies of Cuba or North Korea or Venezuela, you have to take into account the fact that these economies have been crippled by U.S. embargoes and sanctions for, not even just embargoes and sanctions, but in 2014, the Venezuelan economy was crippled by the U.S. encouraging Saudi Arabia to ramp up oil production, which caused a rut in the largely oil-dependent economy of Venezuela. So, like, and then in the case of, like, Venezuela, you also have issues of corruption, which you also had in the Soviet Union. And so, yeah, I think under a closer historical investigation, when you start to examine the reasons these places failed, it largely doesn't suggest some inherent flaws with the economic model of communism, I guess.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, you actually just brought up another point that I don't want to focus on right now,
Mm-hmm.
but it leads me to believe maybe along with the economic problems, there's just major human nature problems of whenever you have a group of people who are in charge of running an economy, these are people, and human nature isn't necessarily like a good thing, where people are corrupt. And when you're not in a democracy like America, where you can be held accountable for your corruption, although I know with Trump in office, it seems like maybe you can be, but he'll be out in a few months, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, like, generally there's a lot more stability when people are held accountable with elections every few years.
Oh, yeah.
Versus,
I completely
like,
agree with that. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that is a huge critique that I levy at experiments like Venezuela and like North Korea, is the idea that, when you sort of concentrate power in the way that they did, it creates a condition which is not conducive to the end goal of communism, because, you're creating a small group of elites who have an interest in continuing perpetuating their power through authoritarian means, and then you're going to create a mass of working people who are sort of not involved in the economic and political activity of the country, which sort of diminishes the revolutionary fervor and the ability of the people to guide their own society, which is what the end goal of communism advocates for. So when it comes to like the consolidation of power, I think that's a very good point. I just don't think it's a point against communism intrinsically. I think it's a point against the methods which certain Marxists and communists have historically advocated for achieving communism.
Okay. So I guess I agree with you there. Like, I don't think, like, you could theoretically have the central planners be elected every 2 years and be held accountable the same way the leaders are here in a communist society,
or
right?
just like, what a lot of communists advocate for is, and I remember you said earlier that, what I was advocating for was sort of top down rather than bottom up, but a lot of communists don't advocate for not like electing central planners that plan the economy every couple of years, but rather the people democratically planning the economy through networks of workers' councils and consumers' councils, all negotiating with one another to arrive at a feasible plan and so on.
Okay, I like that a lot more.
Yeah.
That I'm more comfortable with being practical and like not having the risks of human corruption.
For sure. I agree.
But when you're talking about these worker councils, that sounds a lot like trades and capitalism. Like, you can only be a part of a worker council if you're working, right? Like, you worker councils are based on like groups of people working in this area form a council and they trade with groups of people working in this different area, right?
I would. Yeah,
I'm guessing. I don't know.
Sure, I would be. I get where you're coming from. I would be hesitant to like draw up like too like I would hesitate to try to get too like overzealous with trying to predict how a communist society would function, because ultimately I think whatever predictions I'm going to make aren't really going to have any bearing on reality. But I could definitely see that being the case, where like your ability to participate in the workers' council is predicated upon like, say, you working in a certain region or a certain industry or a certain building or so on. I'm not exactly sure how it would be structured, but
yeah, okay. So I guess this leads me to another thing where like it makes sense to me. Like, a point I think like you could make is that like feudalists, they didn't ever predict like how capitalism would form. They were just like lots of people who said, this system's not working very well, we should move to something better, and our current system is what eventually came out of that. And you're kind of talking about communism in the same way. But I even despite the like historical precedents, I'm still not comfortable with that argument really. Like, I don't think, like, it's very hard to move towards a system if we don't even know what that system we're moving towards is. Because like any flaw you levy against capitalism, like, you can argue for like a ton of different systems other than communism to replace that. Like, I think you need specific reasons why communism should be the next step instead of anarchism or syndicalism or whatever. Why communism is like the one to go with. You need to like have somewhat of like a better idea than you've given me yet of like the details of what you want this communist society to look like.
Yeah, so 2 points, I guess, that I would make here. So for one, when it comes to this idea about like, you need to sort of lay out how it would function in order for me to be comfortable with it and so on. I completely understand that impulse, but here's how I would approach it. So when I advocate for communism, I don't say, here's what institutions and things will exist. and here's exactly how society will organize this and that. I more so approach it from the angle of here's what communism explicitly will not have. So I think that's the more accurate or precise thing for me to talk about. Isn't what communism will have or what a communist society would entail. It's what a communist society will not entail. And that's a simple answer. It won't entail money. It won't entail markets. It won't entail a economy, an internal organization of the workplace wherein workers are all subservient to an unaccountable capitalist, and so on. So I think if one were to make an argument against capitalism, or if one were uncomfortable with capitalism or didn't want capitalism, in order to justify that, I think they would have to take one of the things which communism, or any number of the things which communism explicitly will not have, and show that that is necessary. And if you can't show that any of the things which communism is doing away with is necessary for a functioning society, then you are necessarily admitting that a communist society is plausible and, workable, and if my arguments against capitalism are correct, desirable.
Okay, I'm not sure if that's valid. Like,
Okay.
let me try to grasp it a bit better.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me if this is it. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
you're saying that basically, let's see how I put this. If there are things that you want to take away from capitalism, and if you can't show that taking these away, that any one of these things is necessary, or no, if you can't show that any of these things necessarily ruins the system, like it's necessarily going to lead to failure, then that means getting rid of it it's plausible to have a system without it.
Mm-hmm. So
That wasn't as
I guess
no,
to be
go.
a little bit more precise, I wouldn't say that in order to argue against communism, you have to show that like one of the things which it's doing away with is like so necessary that without it, it would completely collapse the economy. Like, I'm not setting the bar that high. I just think that you need to show that one of the things that communism does away with is necessary to the extent that doing away with it would make society worse off than
Okay.
capitalist society.
Okay, so let me try to make one of those points of why it would be worse off.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go back to the point about the incentives to work.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, like basically in capitalism, most people are working for money so they can use that money to buy the things they want. And that's the major incentive. The more you work, the more things you're able to get generally. And your counter was that, yeah, but it takes away from other incentives like giving back to the community, like doing things for self-improvement and doing other things you actually enjoy rather than your job. Right?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, sure.
Okay, but these other things you'll be doing are going to be a lot less productive for society. Like there are jobs that society needs. Let's say like back in the day, like coal miner, now let's say being a waitress or being like a security guard. I mean, I'm trying to think of like the jobs people generally don't like a sanitation worker maybe, like that most people don't like, but they do it for money. And I don't see who would want to do those things in a society where everybody can do what they want. I think people are going to be doing generally, actually not even generally, inherently less productive things. Because if the thing you would want it to do would be more productive than what you are doing right now, in capitalism, you'd get paid more. Because in capitalism, the more productive you are to society, the more you get paid. So you're geared towards being as productive towards society as possible. So the second you take away that incentive of why you should work, everybody is inherently going to do jobs that are at the minimum just as productive as what they were doing before, but in general, it's going to be less productive.
Yeah, okay. So I would respond to that by saying if you need incentives to get people to do the jobs that like nobody else would want to do, there are ways of incentivizing that don't require money or a profit motive or anything like that. For example, and I'm not advocating for like the resurgence of nobility titles. I'm just using an example. But like there have been in the past like nobility titles where like you get certain like social ranks that, you know, elevate your social status if you know, perform certain tasks for society, you know, like sir and stuff like that. So, and I'm not saying that we should bring that back or anything necessarily. I'm just saying that like this sort of goes to show that throughout history, you can find a variety of ways of incentivizing people to do things for the benefit of society without the intermediation of money or markets or profit. So yeah, I guess that's one of the
Okay, but
things I
wait.
would say to that.
Any of those things you could institute under capitalism. Like if we want a bigger incentive to have sanitation workers, we could provide anything you want to give in communism to them, we could give under capitalism to them. Like, and we theoretically could be or should be.
Um,
Like what about capitalism prevents us from giving like higher social status, like calling people sure if they do jobs that are good for society. Like if you think about veterans, that's a job that like going in the military or being a cop, or jobs that, while lots of people on the left, me included, don't necessarily think are ideal or should be having such revered status. But in general, as society and as a government, we've chosen to and given them privileges because we think it's a good job for society. And I don't see why we can't do that for tons of other jobs. And yeah, so then we'd still have people being less productive. And this added thing you're saying of why they'd be more productive could be true of capitalism too.
yeah, I mean, for certain, you could do a lot of things to incentivize people to do things under capitalism in addition to money. But this sort of goes back to the point that I was making originally, which is that, yes, money in a capitalist society is a primary motivator for the incentive to work and so on. But that doesn't but that also, the primacy of that incentive suppresses the extent to which other incentives are realized. So that would sort of be like my point about that. And so that's why I think that like I don't think you can say that getting rid of the profit incentive would necessarily lead to a reduction in the overall incentives, because it's sort of more of a zero-sum game than that. Like if you take away the primary incentive of profit under capitalist society, other incentives are going to become more prominent. You know, people are going to, under communist society, not be as alienated from their communities, and therefore would be more willing to do stuff for the benefit of their community and so on. So I guess that's sort of like what I would say to that.
Okay. I don't know if there's any point in arguing this further. We can move on because
Sure.
I don't know like if there's any empirical data or logic behind this. It's more of a gut feeling I have. And I guess unless if you have evidence for me, kind of a gut feeling you have, like your gut feeling is that the alienation and the other things you'd be doing now that you don't have to work for wages would lead you to being more productive than you previously were. While my intuition is people are going to be generally a lot less productive. If you told me I would have basically living in the same house with the same material goods, same amount of food and everything, whether I worked or didn't work, I would work on things I enjoy, and the things I enjoy, like debating people like you, are not the things that are productive to society. Sure, I provide some entertainment, but I don't think I'm that entertaining. And I think that most people wouldn't even be doing what I'm doing. I think a lot of people would play video games all day. Like, there's a lot of things people would be. There's no point in me talking further because this isn't worth arguing. I'll just finish by saying, yeah, my gut feeling is that people are going to be a lot less productive if they're not gaining anything out of working other than their own self fulfillment.
Yeah. So yeah, okay, so I understand what you say when you say it's a gut feeling. I do have like some empirical evidence which might be like sort of relevant to what we're talking about. So my fundamental thesis is that when people aren't being, you know, like alienated from their community and from other people and from their own labor, like they are under capitalism, since they're working, as Panakoic said, for foreign profit at foreign command. People are going to be more productive, and they're going to, care more about what they're doing and so on. Like, that's the sort of the fundamental argument that I'm levying. And this has sort of been borne out because obviously there's never been a society which is communist in the way that I advocate for. There's never been a society which meets my definition of communism. But, there are worker co-ops in capitalist society which have allowed workers a greater control over the means of production and have, facilitated, like, I guess, sort of less alienation because now they, own their own businesses. And the data on worker co-ops sort of finds that my fundamental thesis has been borne out, because when workers have more control over their workplace and over what they're doing, and they aren't as alienated from their own labor and so on, worker co-ops have found to have been more productive than workers and worker co-ops have been found to be more productive than workers in like traditional firms. So I think there's like a little bit of empirical evidence which supports my hypothesis on this.
Yeah, worker co-ops are cool. I have nothing against them. I guess the problem is it's very hard for them to grow at the rate non-worker co-op firms grow. So they generally, I think, would stay at like a constant rate of like having, let's say, 20 employees that all make good wages, but you're never going to grow to a firm with 100,000 employees with a worker co-op.
Right. Yeah, and also it's just like for worker co-ops, it's like more, it's harder for them to like get started. Because of, for example, they have to rely on like loans, because it's harder for a worker co-op to attract investors, because obviously investors are only going to want to invest if they are going to be granted control over, the business, which obviously in a worker co-op that's impossible. So they largely have to rely on loans, which can be hard to come by. So yeah, I agree with you exactly on the worker co-ops thing.
But I think like the worker co-ops are good. We have nothing against, like, we have nothing prohibiting them in capitalism. Maybe we could, like, I would actually be for, theoretically, if there's enough evidence, having government provide maybe like subsidies to them or something, because I do think they do lead to like happier and more productive workers. So yeah, but that's definitely not communism yet.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, the point is that people are more productive when they're not alienated, and I think that was a valid point you made.
Yeah,
that was like the point of bringing up the worker co-ops.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think we're going. I think we should move on, because I don't think my gut or your gut is being changed on this one.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, but just to like clarify before we move on, do you think that? Because you sort of like compared it to like my gut feeling versus your gut feeling, but like, do you think that maybe the data showing that like less alienation and more worker control over the means of production leads to higher productivity, do you think that would in some way suggest sort of the fundamental argument that I'm positing, which is that, doing away with this alienative mechanisms of capitalism would lead to a higher incentive for workers to do things for their own personal development and for their mutuals and community and so on? Because like, I feel like that's sort of like what that evidence would suggest.
No. Yeah, your evidence does suggest that, but it doesn't suggest that it overcompensates for the loss of incentive. Like, it just shows that there is an increased incentive from this, but it doesn't show that the increased incentive when you're not being alienated, I think, overdoes the loss of incentive when you're not getting paid. So it's a piece of evidence, but it's not going to like change my mind for now.
So what do you think about like the fact that it's been found that even when workers are like receiving unemployment or even like receiving a UBI, if they can't find like labor to do, they become like super depressed, most people, and they're suicide rates skyrocket and their drug addiction rates skyrocket and domestic abuse cases skyrocket when people can't find work. Because I think that, to me, suggests that people like need shit to do. And so when they can't get shit done, even if it's not a matter of just achieving the means of sustaining their lives, that is detrimental to people's mental health and just health in general. Because I think that sort of suggests that, obviously, you don't need to pressure people with the promise of money in order to get them to work. So I think when you combine the fact that people just naturally have an inclination to, need to do things in their lives, and when you combine that with the fact that people have shown to be more productive when they're not alienated by the mechanisms of capitalism to the same extent, I think that all of this like accumulative data to me would suggest that the creation of a communist society wouldn't squander the incentive of people to work to any extent which would lead to like considerable harm to society.
Considerable is the key word there.
Okay. Well, I would argue that even if you could say that like it would lead to a very small impact on the incentive for people to work, I don't think that I would argue that a small negative impact on people's incentives to work would not overcompensate all of the negative externalities of capitalism. Like, I think that would be a worthy trade-off. So, like, if we can do away with, say, the instability of capitalism, if we can do away with the alienation of capitalism, the exploitation which capitalism is based on, the imperialism that capitalism breeds, and all of these things, if we can get away from all of these terribly harmful negative externalities at the cost of, a small, non-considerable, in your words, negative impact on the incentive for people to work, I would say that's probably like more than a fair trade in my opinion.
I agree. I would say that if it is as like negligible as you're saying, then I would trade like some loss in productivity for just
Sure.
happier people. Because of course I couldn't care less about how many goods are being produced. I care about how happy people are.
Right. Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah.
producing more goods leads to less happiness than producing less goods in a scenario. I go with, let's produce less goods if people are going to be happier this way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I think we can agree on that then. I would just say that, if we can both agree on that premise, then I would also add in the premise that, all of the different data points which I gave you tend to suggest that there would not be a considerable impact on people's productivity. I think we have no reason to fundamentally believe that based on all the available data. So yeah, I would say that, just taking the premise that you've accepted and adding the premise, which is implied by all the data, would lead to the conclusion that I'm advocating for, I guess. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I guess what I haven't accepted both premises yet is what I'm saying. I accepted the first or second one you named. You put them in different orders, different times. I accept that if it's going to lead to a happier society, having less production, then we should do it. But I haven't been convinced that this new system would lead to an increase in happiness that outweighs the loss in productivity. Because don't forget, productivity isn't just the amount of goods. It's the pharmaceutical companies that produce all the medicines that make people's lives easier, right? It's the ability to have better entertainment. These are all things that are fundamental to capitalism, in my opinion, where when you increase the incentives to create like better medicines or create better quality entertainment, there's a billion things. I think that is going to directly impact the happiness. So I think the loss of happiness from losing this production would outweigh the gain in happiness from not being alienated and being able to do what you want.
Yeah, I guess where I would just disagree with you is that I still think fundamentally, based on the data that I've provided, we have no reason to believe that there would be a considerable impact on people's productivity,
I don't think you provided that data, though.
Yeah.
You provided two pieces of data, or a few. You provided data that people don't enjoy doing nothing, right?
Right. Which, well,
that doesn't mean they want to do productive things. They might just want to be... Go.
Yeah, so it's not that people just like don't enjoy doing nothing. It's that when people don't have anything to do, they like sink into like depression, very often commit suicide, like very harmful mental impacts are incurred on these people when they don't have anything to do, which I think points pretty concretely to the idea that you don't need a sort of a profit motive in order to get people to work, because it's sort of like the natural state of people that we need shit to do, because obviously we've evolved to always be doing shit, interacting with other people, that kind of thing. And then when you combine that with the data that
Wait, can we don't combine yet? I want to because
sure,
I
sure.
haven't accepted this one. So
Okay.
let's combine that the next until after we agree with this, then we can
Sure.
combine that. Okay, so the fact that people get depressed and have mental problems when they aren't doing anything, so they really do need to do something. That just points to the fact that they'll be doing something, but it doesn't point to the fact that they'll be doing anything productive to society. Like there's nothing about being productive to society that leads to this happiness. Like you could just really want to just spend your time doing art or woodworking or anything else that provides a very minimal value to society with your time, and those are all things that you can do in your society where you're getting the same amount of goods back no matter what you do. And the second thing is these people who are giving you UBI, it's not like we're restricting them from getting out and getting a job or doing whatever hobby they want or giving back to society, doing social work. They choose not to into society. So I don't see why they would choose to all of a sudden in a communist society decide to start giving back and working towards the community if they're not doing it now. Those are my two questions.
Okay, so first of all, when it comes to I'm not exactly sure what you meant by the second thing when you talked about people taking UBI.
Well, yeah, I thought you brought up an example of like the test where people have UBI and they don't do work, that they suffer with mental problems. Did I misunderstand you there?
I meant like yeah, I wasn't referring to people who receive UBI and therefore decide not to work. I was talking about like people who literally cannot find work because of like mass unemployment and recession and so on. And I'm just saying, like, even when these people are compensated, so it's not just a matter of them being upset because they need money. People still face like mental issues.
Okay. So I
Yeah.
misunderstood. I misunderstood you there. Okay, so then what I'd say to that is that these recessions are very temporary and rare under capitalism. In general, like unemployment was like 4%. In general, if you want a job and you're a capable person, you're going to find a job to do.
Mhm.
Like it's not that hard to find a job where you do work in capitalism.
Sure. Okay. So to respond to your 2 points, then I guess respectively, for one, I mean, sure, there's no guarantee that if people need to do things, that doesn't mean they necessarily want to do things which are specifically productive to society. But it does mean that they have the need to go out and do things, and then it could just be a matter of society incentivizing or directing those people in a way so that the thing that they have an inclination to do, at least sometimes, is meeting the needs of society.
That sounds a lot like social democracy. And like a social democracy of my ideal, you have enough money on welfare and a social safety net that you don't have to be working. But if you do choose to go out and work, you can get a job doing whatever you want, or you can work for yourself. But the incentives of money are going to lead you to go get a job that's productive to society. The higher you get paid, generally, the higher productive wise you are to society.
Yeah,
Right? The more value is great.
so I would
So what's the problem with that?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I would just say that you can incentivize people such that what they're doing is productive for society without money. And I think it's preferable to do it without money and without markets, because the existence of money and markets breeds a lot of other negative externalities, which I don't think society needs to accept. And this sort of relates to the second point that you made that I was also going to respond to, because you said that, like, most of the time people can find something to work. Recessions are usually not very long, and they're usually not very severe, so on, and they're pretty rare. So I would argue a couple things here. I think, for one, my fundamental point was just that this data goes to show that people generally want to do things. So I think that was just sort of like the core thing that I was arguing with that. And I think the frequency and depth of recessions under capitalism is a fundamental different issue. But when it comes to that issue, I mean, the history of capitalism shows that, and Richard Wolff talks about this all the time, and this is something which is backed up by, like, all of the available empirical data from the the Bureau of Economic Statistics and so on, and pretty much every source that we have available to us. But everywhere that capitalism has ever existed, and this is something specific to capitalism, meaning it didn't exist in prior modes of production like feudalism, every 4 to 7 years, give or take, this is just an average, capitalism enters into an economic downturn. Sometimes they're not very deep. A lot of times, such as in 2008, they are very deep. In the Great Depression, but nonetheless, every 4 to 7 years, a downturn happens, and what tends to happen is many people lose their jobs. There's correlations between recessions and, like, suicide rates increasing drastically. Domestic abuse rates increase. All of the things I talked about earlier with when people can't find work. So yeah, I think a society which breeds this sort of instability, where, like, every few years there is this recession which at best only kills like a few hundred people, I think that's an unacceptable fact of society.
Okay, here's what I'll say to that. Like, the same thing you said about how, like, all these communist societies that have failed so far, you can't say, like, that's an inherent problem with them. That's specific policy failures and corruption failures they had at that time. I'll say the same thing about recessions. Every recession is either a policy failure, in my opinion, or it's something that would happen in a society no matter what. Like the coronavirus right now, it doesn't matter what type of form of government you have, communist, whatever. If there's a pandemic, a lot of people are going to die. People will have to stay at their house, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, like, the current crisis we're in right now is not an intrinsic to capitalist recession. And every other crisis can be blamed on just policy failures. And our policy is getting better and better. The Fed really wasn't, like, advanced in, like, their knowledge of how to, like, maintain monetary policy until, like, let's say the 70s and 80s, really. That's when, like, there was a lot of big breakthroughs in the Fed. And, like, since then, we've been pretty stable. Like, we've had, since 2008, like, the last crisis, we went 12 years without any recession. And the only reason we're in one right now is because of the coronavirus.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, so a couple things about that. So when it comes to, like, comparing communism to capitalism, because obviously, I said you can sort of blame a lot of the failures of attempts at communism on, certain policy decisions and certain aspects of corruption and, certain external factors like imperialistic intervention and economic sanctions and embargoes and so on. But I would be careful with comparing, like, saying, well, if you can say that with communism, I can say the same thing with capitalism, because it is true, I think, that communism and capitalism are at different stages of historical development. So, like, a point that I argue a lot when people bring up this argument of, like, communism's never worked is, while it is true that communism has not been successfully achieved and has been attempted numerous times, that was also true of capitalism as it emerged out of feudal society. Capitalist economies, when it was sort of emerging out of feudalism, started up and then imploded in on themselves, or went in directions that were bad and people ended up rejecting them. And, capitalist societies, just failed and collapsed and so on. And so, but that phase of capitalism's history has been moved past. Capitalism has been the successful, globally dominant economic mode of production for a very long time. And so when you see that capitalism has been existing as the dominant mode of production in almost like every society for hundreds of years and has never been able to overcome the instability that seems to be inherent to it, that's a bit different than communism failing in its initial attempps at implementation, just as capitalism did. And just to add like one more thing, I'm sorry, I don't want to like gish gallop you or anything, but just one more thing. I think that you can look at this in like a practical level. So I don't think I have not been convinced that one can show on like a practical theoretical level that intrinsic to communism is the results that you talked about. But I think you can pretty soundly argue that crisis is going to be intrinsic to capitalism, because there's so many mechanisms through which capitalism creates its own crises that it seems borderline impossible to shut down all of those mechanisms and do away with all of them simultaneously in any meaningful or lasting way. And just final point would be going back to what I said earlier, which is that even if you could do like a ton of regulations in social democracy, I don't think it's going to last, because I think the history of capitalism shows that when you achieve certain reforms, they're historically repealed by capitalists. And then even if you could come up with this massive policy scheme which got rid of all mechanisms of economic collapse, it would still be preferable to have a system which wouldn't cause those crashes in the first place, which we'd then have to focus so much energy into preventing.
Okay, that was a lot. Let me try to remember all the
Feel
points.
free. I'm sorry, I laid a lot down.
I mean, I've been saying a lot too. That's just the way conversations work.
Yeah, sure.
It's no fault of your own. I know you're not trying to gish gallop me or anything, and I'm not trying to do the same to you.
Sure.
Let's think. What point do I want to go to first? Okay, so the idea that capitalism is kind of like it's in its final phase, I don't agree with. Like, there are new breakthroughs in economics all the time still, and we're still learning a lot about how an economy functions. So I just don't buy the idea that like we've reached the peak of capitalism. We're not getting like any better than this. We're not going to be able to solve a way to get rid of these recessions, because I actually think like the advancements we've made led us to basically solving it. Like we had since Obama a great run, and it looked like it was going to keep going for another like few years at least until the coronavirus came. So I actually think like the 4 to 7 years thing is a true average, and it was true for a long time. But I actually think we might be getting beyond that 4 to 7 year recession thing. The other thing you brought up how the problem is all these reforms eventually go away because the forces of capital push against any of these reforms that lead to welfare and all these other things we want. I disagree with that in a sense. There's always going to be the fight, but in any system, you're going to have to fight to maintain the system. Democracy is no different. Communism is no different. Socialism is no different. Anarchism is no different. There's always going to be a fight to maintain your system and create progress from it. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's anything intrinsic there about capitalism where we would lose all the reforms. And in fact, we don't. Like, our laws are so much better now than they were 200 years ago. You go up a lot, then you take it one step back, then you take 10 steps more forward, generally, is how our progress has been. If you look at the labor laws and workers' rights that we had 200 years ago, where we had 8-year-olds working in a coal mine 15 hours a day or whatever, versus now. So I think we generally actually do keep the reforms. It just sometimes they get rolled back a bit before we bring them forward more. And lastly, your point was that you would just prefer a system where we didn't need all these regulations and to figure all this stuff out to prevent the recession. Wouldn't it be easier to have a system where recession wasn't intrinsic to it? To that, I would say that, yeah, on just this, just looking at whether the intrinsicness of recessions, then on that point, communism might be better. Although the fact of the matter is, we don't know. Maybe it's also going to have the same problems with the recessions. We just don't know it has these intrinsic problems that we just haven't discovered yet because it hasn't been tried enough. But yeah, that's my main response.
Yeah. So so there's a lot to go over there. So I think the first point that you made was I'll sort of like work backwards because your later points are more fresh in my mind. But okay, so you argued that maybe communism will have the same sort of instabilities. We just don't know because we haven't really tried it yet. I don't think that's true because I think given everything we know about capitalist recessions, they don't seem to be something which you could reasonably argue would manifest under communism.
No, I'm saying it would manifest for different reasons we haven't thought about yet. If it is true of communism, it will be true for different reasons. It won't be true due to bubbles being created and deregulation and things like that. I'm saying it would be true for these things we haven't thought about yet.
Sure. So, I mean, it's like, it's of course theoretically like possible that you establish communism and then through its own mechanisms it creates things which are analogous to like capitalist crises or have the same negative externalities. But I would say that like of course that's theoretically possible, but I don't think we have any reason to believe that that would be the case. And it would seem that like the default epistemological like assumption would be that if we have no reason to believe, if nobody's proposed any mechanisms through which we should reasonably believe communism would birth this externality, we have no reason to assume or believe that communism would birth that externality. So I would say that we just don't really, I don't see any reason to believe that that would be the case or that that's a valid criticism against communism. As far as capitalism, we've learned a lot more, and I'm struggling to remember the arguments that you made.
I can just repeat them one at a time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
So in short, like one by one, just like give the first one and.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, so I think I'll just write them down.
Okay, cool. So the first point I was addressing, if I remember correctly, was that this is intrinsic to capitalism. Like we've reached the stage of capitalism where it's been tried for long enough. It's been for a few hundred years where it's just intrinsic at this point. And my argument was, I actually just don't think so. I think we're still making a ton of progress. I mean, like we haven't even gotten to social democracy yet, which is what I want. So like I could just say like true capitalism hasn't been tried yet in my like point of view of what my true capitalism is. And once you reach that, we won't be having these recessions inevitably.
Okay. And that one, then what was I believe the other point you made was about how it was about my point about how capitalism does away with reforms, and you talk about how we've actually made a great deal of progress with reforms.
And that in any system we'd have to fight.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, let me finish writing these down real quick.
Sure.
Okay. Were there any points you made besides that and then the one that I already addressed?
I don't think so. No, I think you got it.
Okay. So, as far as the idea that crisis isn't intrinsic, or that capitalism isn't at like the highest stage where we can learn more about it or whatever. So I didn't mean to argue that we're at like the highest stage of capitalism where we can't learn anything more about capitalism or how to like stop its externalities. What I was, I guess, suggesting is that when we've seen that throughout capitalism's several century long history, that there has always been an intrinsic element of like on average every 4 to 7 years there's a downturn. If we've seen that this is the history and that across all kinds of different societies ranging all along the range of economic freedom, all countries from the most economically free libertarian countries to the most like social democratic Scandinavian countries, they've always had, to varying degrees, to be fair, slightly varying degrees, but they've never been able to, whether they're using Keynesian economics or libertarian like neoclassical economics, the fact that throughout history this recurring element of crisis is never something which has been meaningfully overcome in the long term seems to suggest to me that this is something that's intrinsic, and I think that would be like the most rational response to that existing historical data, unless you can provide like a society or a policy which has historically meaningfully over decades shown to overcome the recurring crisis of capitalism. And I know you mentioned how like the US since 2008 didn't have a crisis for like quite a long time. I don't think that having a society where there wasn't a crisis for like 12 years, like I don't think that is sufficient evidence that the several hundred year precedent of recurring crisis has been completely overcome. I just don't think that that's like sufficient evidence for the overturn of that large a historical precedent, because I mean, from your own admission, this precedent that you're saying, which is like we've just overcome it, we only have 10 years of data for this. So I just think it would be very hasty to draw that conclusion based on that.
I don't think it's. Can I just? I want to do one at a time.
Sure.
We don't go over like too much a lot.
Yeah.
I'd say it's not sufficient, but I'd say when you look at the reasons why, like it's not like I'm finding a random 12-year period in the 1950s where we were had no recession. I'm saying in the present, since we instituted the policy of quantitative easing, which was a new technique the Fed began to use under Janet Yellen, or actually was it Ben Bernanke? I don't even know which one of them started it. But the point is, the policy of basically like flooding the market with money, correlates with the 12-year period of no downturn. So I'm saying, like, I think we have like a argument to be made that the Fed's new policies they use, they have interest on excess reserves, they have quantitative easing, et cetera, that those are the policies that are leading to us not having any more recessions in general, except when crises that you can't predict come up that have nothing to do with capitalism, like the current one. And the other thing I'd say is that our countries, or all countries in the world right now, are pretty much very interdependent. So recession in one country generally will lead to recessions in other countries, which generally will then lead to like a global recession. That's how most recessions work, unless if it's in some small country that has a specific reason it's having a recession. Mm-hmm. So I don't like the point about how we've tried so many different societies throughout the world and they all keep getting the recessions, because I think these recessions are based on these other countries. Like the United States, if the USA goes into a recession, pretty much everybody else is going to go into a recession just because they depend on trading with us. So that's why they're failing, not because of their own economies, but because of ours.
Okay, yeah, hold on. I'm just
you can get that down.
Yeah. Okay, so I think you made 2 points there. One, you made the point that Yeah, okay. So you made the point about quantitative easing, about how, our drop in having recessions correlates with these new sort of policies. Um, Two, you made the point about how my point about every society having a recession being evidence of the intrinsicness of recessions to capitalism is wrong because of globalization. Um, yeah, okay. So did you make any other points that you can remember?
No, no, no. I tried making 2 points.
Okay, so my points on that would be, for one, as far as the idea that the drop in recessions correlates with quantitative easing. Um, so I am hesitant to buy that argument because, so first of all, when you look at like the mechanisms of quantitative easing, I don't think that the things which quantitative easing addresses, maybe you could get more into this. I know you're an econ major, so maybe you could like get more into like what quantitative easing does. But from my knowledge, what quantitative easing aims to accomplish doesn't meaningfully address all of the mechanisms which historically have led to capitalist crises. And two, and so I think based on that, it would be hard to conclude that crisis should from this point on be just gone forever and no longer recurring in capitalism, because it doesn't address all of the things which have historically led to crises. And also, like, you bring up this point about like you're sort of smuggling in this premise. I don't use the term smuggling as like a pejorative or anything, but you're sort of like bringing in this premise that if coronavirus wouldn't have happened, there wouldn't have been another recession right now. But I'm pretty sure like most economists, from like Richard Wolff to like Peter Schiff to like, all across the political spectrum, the numbers like the Dow numbers and so on were pretty concretely pointing to the fact that there was going to be another recession soon. Like most economists were projecting that there would be another recession soon, even before we knew about the coronavirus. Our economic indicators were suggesting that there was going to be another recession soon, even without the coronavirus. So I don't like agree with that premise that you're sort of bringing in, I guess. And with regards to your other point about how my point about every society having recessions is wrong because of globalization, I don't think acknowledging globalization really undercuts the argument I was making about how every society has a recession. Because whether or not the reason every society has a recession is because capitalism is an intrinsically globalized economic system by its nature and by its history, that doesn't make a difference to my argument, which is that recession is just intrinsic to capitalism. I admit fully that capitalism played a huge role in globalizing the world, and that's one of the things that is to be celebrated about capitalism, is that it did a great job globalizing. And I will fully admit that this globalization has had an impact on the fact that every society is seeing recessions. But I just don't think that undercuts my point in any way, because my point is just that recession seems to be intrinsic to capitalism, and whether or not that's because of globalization is a different matter and doesn't undermine whether that's a valid critique or not. Yeah, so that's all I would say to that. Just to finally, I just have to get to this one last thing, because I know he'd brought this up and I didn't want to like let it sort of fall away, because I think it's an interesting conversation to have, which is that you talked about how we have made progress with reforms, and in any system, whether that be communism or socialism or capitalism, you're going to have to fight to maintain the system. And I think that's to an extent true, but I think it would be fallacious to say that because in any society you're going to have to fight for the maintenance of that society, that therefore means there's no meaningful difference when it comes to the mechanisms or the primacy of the mechanisms which you're fighting against to maintain that system. So like in capitalism, there's a very clear incentive for capitalists to infiltrate the government and influence those in power with the wealth that they get. There's a very clear and logical incentive for those people to do away with incentives through lobbying and so on, which impinge on their ability to maximize their profits. That's super logical because like it is the logical goal of the capitalists to maximize profits. And if government regulations and policies are in the way of that, then obviously capitalists are going to have an incentive to, do away with that. I don't think that there is a similar incentive under communism for anyone to like destroy the system because they materially benefit from doing so. I don't think that same incentive exists, and if it does, communism doesn't allocate resources in such a way that gives the power to those people that they would need to achieve that ends, which is sort of what capitalism does. And I agree, we have made progress for like as far as reforms. Capitalism today is a lot more bearable than back when it had like child labor and stuff. But I still think that despite the fact that capitalists are willing to let some progress slide when it doesn't severely impinge on their profitability, I don't think that infers that what I was saying is false, insofar as what I was saying is that there's always going to be a fundamental tension there where if you pass a certain regulation or certain policies which severely limit the ability of the power of capitalists, that they're going to have an incentive to do away with that. So yeah, there have been a lot of progress when it comes to like child labor laws, but I think capitalists let those slide to an extent that because those laws don't necessarily severely impinge on their power. But if you try to make laws that do, then you're going to see sort of a different story. And finally, it's my last point. So sorry, I can repeat any of these points if this was too much. But when it comes to the progress that we've made, when it comes to getting rid of child labor laws and getting like decent working conditions and so on, these reforms, this progress had to be made by violent, bloody struggles of unions against capitalists and massively hard and difficult political struggles. And so, again, I would go back to this point that I think it would be preferable, even if I were to say that you could do these, bloody, harsh struggles to sort of do away with some of the externalities of capitalism and make progress on capitalism, it would still be the case that it's preferable to have a system which doesn't birth those negative externalities in the first place, which then you need to correct by, engaging in these struggles.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that was actually a pretty good point, but I actually think there's something there that's like wrong with it. Basically, I see that like in a capitalist system, it's going to be harder to maintain reforms than in a communist system. I see that, but what I don't see is because like I'm talking about in my social democracy, like there's no super PACs. Corporations aren't allowed to spend money on politicians. There's no lobbying, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to abolish that. So I think it would be corporations. Well, they'll always have some effect. If you're a billionaire, you're always going to be able to influence policy just through your connections, and you'll figure your way to weasel your way around the system. But at the end of the day, I'm talking about a system that I want to exist, and you're talking about a system you want to exist. And to get your system, I think takes a lot more fighting than to get mine. So I just find it odd that like your criticism of mine is there's too much fighting when if you think capitalists are working hard to maintain the system now rather than social democracy, just imagine how hard capitalists are going to fight against you for you to abolish capitalists in the first place and abolish corporations, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to fight like hell to ensure communism never happens, and that's going to be a much tougher fight than the fight I want to have.
Yeah. So I would distinguish a couple things because I think there's a slight unintentional equivocation afoot here. I would distinguish between having to fight to fight really hard to achieve a social structure, which is obviously you're going to have to fight to achieve communism. I would distinguish between that and having to fight for the maintenance of a livable iteration of that social structure after it's already been achieved, which I think is what I was arguing is necessary under capitalism. So while it's true that it's going to take a lot more fighting to achieve communism than it is to achieve what you're advocating for, my fundamental argument was that after we've achieved communism, that's it. Whereas even if we are to achieve your system, it's still going to necessarily maintain lots of, decades of fighting and struggle to maintain all these reforms to the capitalists who are constantly incentivized to do away with it. And so I just don't know if your model is sustainable. And over the long term, if we are to go with your societal model over the long term, the constant fight to maintain it is going to be a lot more strenuous and have a lot more negative externalities than the initial fight to just achieve what I'm advocating for, is what I would say to that. As far as the idea that this is the only other point I'm going to make, I'm not going to go on too long because I think you only made 2 points. Is that correct? You only made 2 points?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other point that I remember you making was about wait, what was the other point that you made? I think it was about it was about lobbying, right? Was that the other point?
Well, yeah, it was part of this point. Really, so, what I was really saying was that you a lot of the attacks you bring against my system are about a system that I think is as a predecessor towards my system, where you were just talking about your system without talking about how we get there. So it was kind of all one big point in a sense.
Oh.
My main point is that I think there's a lot more total fighting and a lot more harder fighting going on to achieve your system than towards maintaining and achieving and maintaining my system. And I think there's historical reasons to believe this, because every communist or socialist revolution we've seen throughout history has been insanely bloody. Millions and millions of people have died fighting these revolutions. We have not seen anything comparable to that in the fights toward just getting some reforms in a capitalist system.
Yeah. Okay. So I would disagree with what you're saying because. So if we are to achieve communism, no doubt there's going to be a bloody struggle for it, I'm sure, unless the capitalists decide that they're willing to give their power away, voluntarily, which I don't see as very likely. But yeah, for sure there's going to be a bloody struggle if that were to be achieved. Hopefully, I would like to do it as peacefully as possible. But I think that there's a fundamental difference between and I think you sort of did a bit of a conflation with the numbers that you sort of brought up, because you brought up how, in the fights to achieve communism in, say, the Soviet Union and Mao's China, tens of millions of people died. But that wasn't the struggle to achieve those societies. That was those societies killing masses of their own people because they were organized in shitty ways and led to the consolidation of power and the corruption of those in power. And so I think it wouldn't be right to use the numbers of the people that Mao and Stalin killed as if that's indicative of how bloody the struggle towards communism is. That's rather indicative of how disastrous it is when you allow power to consolidate in a attempt at communism after that society or the revolution has already been achieved.
That's true. So yeah, I didn't mean to conflate them two. I just it was probably wrong of me to assume it was in the millions. Oh no, you probably know more about this than me, because I know there are a ton of wars, revolutionary wars, to achieve these systems. I don't know what the numbers are really. I know about the numbers of the mass killings by Stalin and Mao and whatever, but I don't know what are the numbers. Are they hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands? I would assume it might be close to 1 million, honestly.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. I would have to do more research on that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but yeah, that's I just sort of took objection, I guess, to the citing the figures of how many people Mao and Stalin killed. But yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Um, but so and I would also like object to sort of using like a death count as the metric, because when I said that, I think the constant struggle to maintain your system would lead to more harm than the initial struggle to achieve my system. And then once you achieve that system, there's no struggle against the capitalist to maintain it, because capitalism has been abolished. But when I say that's more harmful, I'm not necessarily just talking about death count. I'm more so talking about just general negative utilitarian utility. Because say we achieve your system, there's going to have to be constant struggles for labor unions against capitalists, which is going to subsume many people's entire lives, or significant portions of people's entire lives, which I think is going to do a lot of harm to a lot of people. I think, even besides the things you're struggling for, even if you're successfully struggling against capitalists trying to undo some of the reforms, you're still going to live under conditions where you're alienated and exploited, and that in itself is going to lead to a lot of negative harm. And then, like, another objection that I was raising is that I don't know how sustainable your model is if people have to launch a constant struggle against the capitalists to maintain your system. I don't know how sustainable that's going to be, or if you could even keep that system over a long term. So I think it would likely, your system would get overturned at some point, which would then cause a lot of other negative harm and negative externality. I
mean,
think that,
just
like,
look at the Scandinavian countries. Like if you look at Denmark, Norway, they aren't like controlled by capitalists generally.
well, I have, like, I know a lot of people in Sweden, I guess, but the general consensus in Scandinavia is that though they're not like full like neoliberal hellscapes like the US or whatever, Scandinavia over time, since its original, let's say, since the golden age of Scandinavian social democracy, which was around like the 70s and the 80s and so on, the social democratic elements have been sort of withering away over time as they've become, sort of more and more neoliberal, more and more neo-capitalist, is the general trend in Scandinavian countries. So, like, yeah, I would just in general argue that having a system where you might have to, sacrifice some initial things, sacrifice some negative utility, sacrifice some harm, or allow some harm to be incurred in achieving that society. And then once you've achieved that society, it's, stable, and you get all of these, positive benefits of not having the negative externalities of capitalism anymore. I think that's preferable than having a system where you constantly have to fight to preserve the reforms that you've won. And then no matter how hard you fight, the reforms that you've won are probably going to go away anyways. And even if they don't, you won't be able to use reform to do away with all of the harmful aspects of capitalism, because, there's so many, and so many of them are so intrinsic, like alienation and exploitation and the undemocratic model of the workplace. So yeah, I guess that's just in general what I would argue on that front.
Okay, yeah. So, with the capital's ability to like screw with the democracy or whatever system you instituting, I actually think even if you get to a communist society, like you actually mentioned this before, how whenever like a country like Cuba or North Korea, they face tremendous embargoes and sanctions, et cetera, because capitalist countries want to destroy them. That's going to be true. Like if you got a communist society, unless if you get the whole world to turn communist at once, you are going to have to be at a constant fight with all these capitalist countries that see you as like an intrinsically evil ideology, like America did during the Cold War, where
Yeah.
we went to war to fight against such an ideology. Like I actually think it's going to be a different type of battle. Like in my case, you're fighting against capitalists within your own state, but we're here you're fighting against other states' capitalists. But in both cases, I actually think there still is a fight, even if you get to your system.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good point. But what I would say to that is Marxists have long understood the need for the need for internationalism when it comes to revolution and when it comes to establishing socialism, because obviously, you're going to need some sort of large international movement if you want to not get, fucked with by imperialist powers who are going to place embargoes on you and, perhaps even invade you or stage a coup, and so on. So that's what I would say to that. And I would say that that's why communists don't advocate. Like, I feel like this would be a valid criticism if a Marxist, or if I were here arguing that we should like establish communism in like one country alone and then just do whatever from there. But communists generally realize that in order for communism to succeed, you are going to need, to some extent, not like the entire world, but to some extent, an international revolutionary movement. And then once the revolution has been won, you're going to need some sort of a transitory state where you use the state and so on to help facilitate the transition to socialism for the rest of the world, and support the international movement and so on. So like, yeah, I guess that what you're saying isn't so much for me an argument against capital or against communism per se. It's just an important fact that communists need to keep in mind when it comes to talking about how we're going to achieve communism. And it's something which Marxists generally have always, kept in mind. I mean, Engels in the Principles of Communism wrote about this specifically, how any revolution is going to need to be an international movement.
Okay. Cool. I guess I don't have anything else to say. It's not like I agree if you're able to get like a ton, like let's say 60-70% of the world's population to get into the system together, then yeah, it will be a much easier fight. I mean, even then, there's going to be the 30% capitalists that are going to be very pissed and going to try to fight to overturn you guys and like go to war with you, whatever. They won't want to trade with you. But yeah, if you are able to make the effort international enough, then eventually you'll be able to end the fight.
Sure.
But I just see so much fighting going on. Like, from a utilitarian perspective, again, this might be another point where we're like can't argue any further from here, because I'm just thinking of all the times that these revolutions have been tried and all the lives that have been lost fighting this, and not just lives lost, but just sanity lost, mental health lost. Like when your country's at war with your own country over your economic system, that's not good for anybody utilitarian wise. Even if you don't die, your family members die, people die, people get jailed. And the thing is, like, it's never guaranteed to be successful. Like you as you talked about, you need a transitory period where you move towards like socialism, then towards communism, and that will be having people in charge who very often are going to end up being corrupt, as we've seen in the past, who then lead to mass killings, who aren't like true communists in their heart. They really just want power, and then this whole fight was for nothing. Like, as a utilitarian, like, I just see so much more negative utility in the fight for communism than in the fight for social democracy, irrelevant of the fact of like which one's better. I'm just talking about towards the fighting part.
Yeah, so I would agree with you that the fight for communism in itself, like if we just narrow down the frame, right, the fight for communism will incur, from a utilitarian perspective, more harm than the fight for social democracy. But where I'm coming from is the fight for a given system is only a tiny portion of the amount of time as compared to the time that system is actually going to exist. So like the fight for capitalism was like, I think maybe like 100 years or so, but the existence of capitalism has existed for like several hundred years, So I think that what's less important than the fight, or how much harm is going to be incurred by the fight, is how much harm is going to be incurred by the existence of the system, because obviously that's what lasts longer, and therefore that's what's more important. And while it is true that because communism is more radical and more out of the Overton window and more counterintuitive to the interests of those currently in power, that the fight for communism will incur more harm than the fight for social democracy, I think the existence of communism, which is more important, would entail less negative utility than the existence of social democracy for reasons I've already discussed. For example, how
I think those points I agree with.
Yeah.
I think if we're saying like both exist, like we can click a button, one exists, the other exists. Then if we talk about the fight to maintain that system, I'd say there's a good argument that communism will have less fighting. Although I'm still not sure, because we still don't really have any real idea of how the system is going to be run. We just know the types of ways it won't be run. So maybe however it ends up being run is going to have these similar flaws to capitalism.
Yeah.
Just different flaws where it is actually a constant fight to maintain it. I just don't know.
Yeah. So 2 points. So you said that, if you could just press a button and then it just exists, then communism has, a place in the argument, or there's a good argument to be made for communism, but it not so much when you take into account that you're going to have to fight a lot harder for it. But
Oh, no, I didn't even mean to say that.
Oh, okay.
I was ignoring the fighting for it. I was just trying to make a concession, I guess,
Okay.
that, just pure existence, your argument was to maintain, then communism theoretically might be easier to maintain. And I do agree, let's say it's maintained for 500 years, then the utility gained during those 500 years makes up for the utility lost during the 15, 20 years that it costs to get to that where you are for the next 500. So I was really making a concession there.
So, yeah, okay. So I would break this down in a couple of ways. Just to try to, get to the root of this. I know we've been, talking for 2 hours already, but I really think we are at a point where we might be able to make some genuine progress, which I think we already have to an extent, but you know what I mean.
I get you.
Yeah, so I would say that if you are to say, so you said, okay, let's posit theoretically that communism is easier to maintain. And you said you're not necessarily sure this is the case because it is theoretically possible that it would breed its own negative externalities, which we just don't know about. But you said theoretically, if it didn't do that, and if it did last for, say, hundreds of years, it would incur more positive utility than the existence of social democracy. So
wait.
Yeah, sorry.
I just want to make sure we're on the same page. I'm talking not at all about how good the systems are actually run.
Oh.
I'm still of the opinion that social democracy has a higher utility just because of the stuff we talked about earlier. I'm talking about purely from the question of how much it costs to maintain communism would have better utility. But there's other factors to consider.
Okay, so I guess I can still make my point here, but it's just,
you can make your point. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page.
Yeah, I get you. But so if you were be conceding that just in terms of the negative utility incurred by the struggle, right, which is specifically what we're talking about, because there's other things that affect the utility that we were talking about earlier. But you said as long as it does last, say, hundreds of years, and as long as it doesn't have these other, breed its own harmful externalities that we just haven't thought of, that it would incur more positive utility in that respect. But where I would bring that, or sort of where I would take that, is we have no reason to believe that communism would incur these random negative externalities, which we just haven't thought of. We have no reason to believe that would be the case, because nobody's really made a logical or empirical argument for that. So I would say that the epistemological default would be to assume that wouldn't be the case. And also, I think it's pretty rational to assume that communism obviously wouldn't last, because, capitalism has lasted several hundred years. I don't think it it's rational to assume that communism would, for some reason, just last significantly, like a significantly shorter time than that. So I think that by the criteria which you've laid out, it would be the most logical assumption to say that communism would incur more positive utility than capitalism, because the only stipulations that you know, argued would change that, we have no reason to believe that those stipulations would manifest in reality.
Yeah, I agree with you. Just to be clear, I'm not agreeing that communism is better than capitalism. I'm agreeing that if we're talking purely in how hard it is to achieve and maintain a system, that communism, I would agree, is likely to have less costs in that aspect.
Okay. So what and if we have already gone over this, like, I just want to, because I'm sure we're going to be wrapping this up soon because we've been talking for like 2 hours, but just finally, like, what are the things? Because you've said that, you know, it's logical to assume that in terms of the harm incurred by the fighting and the maintaining of the system, communism would not be as harmful as capitalism or social democracy. But you said that there are other factors outside of what we were just talking about, which lead you to think that communism would incur more harm than social democracy. So, like, what are those factors? Is it just like the incentive to work thing that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that's one of the major ones. I think that's not just incentive to work, but in general through distribution of resources, the ability to trade, all these things we discussed. That you push me towards a bit, but I'm still not like with you 100% there. I think I have reason to believe capitalism is going to be lead to a way more productive society than communism, where a lot more value is created. So even if it costs more to maintain the system, I would say that I think the benefit of all the productivity and value would outweigh that.
Okay. So I guess just to, I guess we didn't talk about one of those things a lot, which was the idea of trade creating value. So trade fundamentally is just, you know, someone getting what they want in society. And under capitalism, that happens because markets sort of distribute based on consumer demand, because the price mechanisms are able to take into account, you know, consumer demand, how many people are buying this. But why don't you think we could have mechanisms which have been proposed by, you know, numerous economists and academics like Paul Cockshott or Michael Albert, who propose their differing methods of taking into account consumer demand, whether that be a board which adjusts prices according to how many workers are spending their labor values on certain commodities, or whether that be in the form of consumer representative committees meeting with workers' councils in order to, you know, communicate the demands of the consumers and so on. Like, why do you not think that other mechanisms of taking into consumer demand are plausible as a substitute for sort of the way that markets do it?
They're plausible. It's plausible to me that they'll be able to do it to an extent. I just, as I like said earlier, they'd be a lot less efficient. And you keep bringing up like a few economists who kind of like agree that there are substitutes. But I'd say the vast majority of economists would say that a communist system, any proposed communist system, would be very inefficient. So I don't think like it's fair to like appeal to the authority of a few economists when the vast majority of the authority is actually like in favor of capitalism over communism.
Yeah. So a couple things. So for one, well, I don't think that I was like doing like an appeal to authority to the economists. I was like, even if they weren't economists, right? I don't think that would make any difference to the argument which I was making, which is that there have been proposed ways which show very plausible ways through which a democratically planned economy could take into account consumer demand. So I wasn't necessarily relying on the fact that they're an authority. And as far as the idea of like most capitalists or most economists being pro-capitalism and anti-communism, that is certainly true, but with a caveat there, because we're talking about like the ability of communism to rationally allocate goods with accordance to consumer demand. And while it's true that most economists are anti-communism, that doesn't mean that most economists think that there's no way a planned economy could take into account consumer demand. For example, there's a general consensus among economists, even anti-communist economists. For example, David Friedman, I think his name is, who's like Milton Friedman's son, as well as that other famous economist. I can't believe how I'm blanking on his name right now, but he was a capitalist economist who wrote that work called Theory of the Firm. And they both basically agree that, yeah, the calculation problem, or the idea that a planned economy couldn't rationally take into account consumer demand and so on, isn't really a good argument, because current firms like Walmart and Amazon, massive firms, have found ways to internally efficiently organize their production in their various stores on the basis of methods of internal central planning. What the Theory of the Firm argued. But yeah, so I don't think that, like, most economists necessarily would argue that the calculation problem is valid, that there's no way to take into account of consumer demand without markets or money. And just final point, I know you said that these methods are plausible, they're just not, like, they wouldn't be as efficient, but I'm curious as to how that case goes, because I'm not exactly sure why they would be less efficient by any means. In fact, I think it would probably be more efficient, because capitalism stifles the influence of consumer demand through a lot of ways, such as the lack of a lot of people's ability to make their consumer demand heard, and the ability for companies to monopolize and sort of slight the wishes of consumers by giving them no other options and so on. So yeah, I'm just curious as to how the case goes that communist, like, planned methods of taking into account consumer demand would necessarily be less efficient.
Not necessarily less efficient, just very likely to be less efficient. Because, I mean, like, I'm going to have to look into this, because, like, I study, like, when I study economics in school, none of my professors, like, that was a point, like, a professors would bring up if you asked it to them, and there was no professor that thought, like, there was a feasible method proposed to distribute resources. So, like, I'll have to do more research to see, maybe it's just the school I went to. But the other points you made, let's see. Can you repeat another one of your points? I'll just address them one by one.
Yeah. So I think the main point that I was making was that I didn't think I was appealing to authority when I appealed to those economists. I was more so just presenting the fact that there are proposed and plausible mechanisms of taking into account consumer demand without markets or money. And so, given that people have proposed this, and I've looked on the mechanisms that they proposed, there's no obvious reason to me that any of these mechanisms would be less efficient at taking consumer demand into account. So I'm curious as to why you would assume that that's the case, that they would necessarily be like less efficient. Like, I'm just curious as to how that case goes, like, logically.
Yeah, sure. The logic behind it is, right now, I think a capitalist system basically maximizes the efficiency, in that you bring it down to the individual and firm level, where they, on a day-to-day basis, are able to count their demand of how much demand there is for each product at each price, and on a daily or hourly basis, you're able to adjust your prices to meet the demand, so you don't have an over or under supply. And every other method you've proposed to me, I just don't see how that would be the case, where you'd be able to get it on such a level.
Yeah.
And, I mean, to be fair, I'd never heard of one of the things you proposed. Like, every centrally planned idea I'd ever looked into had been top down, and those have they have always led to failure. But your bottom up idea of through worker councils or whatever, that one I'd have to look into more. But my intuition is it sounded a lot like just capitalists, just like in a capitalist forming through groups, where it's still trading going on with private goods. So yeah. If you have, like, a specific one you'd like to present again, then I could, like, explain to you my problems with it. But I think the best thing to do, honestly, would be, like, if you really want to convince me, because what's going to happen after this is I'm just going to spend a, 10 hours on the internet just reading through economic papers and such, trying to see what everybody says about all these different ideas,
Hmm.
and that's how I'm going to come to my conclusion, really.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Yeah, sure. No, that
that,
sounds completely fair. Um, yeah, so I guess what I would say is that you talked about how, like, under capitalism, firms can look at it and they can see how much, workers are buying on, like, an hourly basis and, like, adjust
yeah,
prices accordingly. Um, So it seems to me that, whatever other system you can propose, like, for example, Paul Cockshott proposes a way where, like, there's, like, initial prices set, which are, like, roughly determined by, like, the amount of labor it took to make something, or not like prices, but like the amount of labor values it takes to acquire a certain product. And then, like, a committee takes into account and consistently looks at how much people are spending their labor vouchers on various items, and then they address the prices of items accordingly. And so I don't see why that mechanism couldn't work on the same, like, hourly basis of, people taking into account how much people are buying given things and adjusting prices accordingly. It's the same exact mechanism. It's just, rather than capitalists doing it, it's like democratically elected committees are doing it and whatever. And then when it comes to, like, the workers' councils, like,
can we just do that one?
yeah, sure.
Because that just sounds a lot like just giving them money. Like, what's the difference between these labor vouchers and money?
Yeah, so the difference between, like, Paul Cockshott's labor vouchers, and by the way, I'm not necessarily advocating for, like, Paul Cockshott's, like, model of planning. I actually don't even agree with it. It's just that when I bring up these models, I'm trying to show that there have been proposed feasible ways of fulfilling these functions without, like, allowing capitalism to exist. It was like, that's the whole point of me bringing that up. It's not necessarily to advocate for anything, but so you asked about Paul Cockshott's model, right? I'm sorry. What was the question that you were asking me again?
Well, yeah, it sounds just a lot like money. Like,
Oh,
how,
yeah.
like,
Sorry. Yeah, sorry,
that
I
was my
forgot
main
that. Yeah,
question.
I have a terrible short-term memory. But yeah, so it's different from money in that when you think of money, money is generally used for, like, exchange on a market. So, like, capitalists produce a thing, and then they go onto the market and they sell that thing, and then they earn a profit and they grow their business and so on. Like, money sort of works within the context of private ownership of the means of production and market exchange, whereas labor vouchers, which Cockshott proposes, would work under the sort of system wherein things are produced not to be sold by a company, but for the direct use of the community, and so on. So that's it's sort of like a different mode of production, which labor vouchers operate in, as opposed to the way that money operates.
So, but how does is this like a UBI type thing where everybody gets the same amount of labor vouchers?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think that's what Cockshott generally argues for.
Okay. Because otherwise, I'd say that it would like be similar to the alienation of capitalism, where you're forced to work for this. But okay, if everybody's getting the same amount of labor vouchers, so it's not really labor vouchers, then it's just vouchers.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm not going to. I don't really care what we call it. So everybody's getting the same amount of these, and then they can spend it to get whatever they want. But can you really spend it to get whatever you want? Because what you want might not exist yet. Like, if I want, I would want. Let's say I'm living in 1990. I'd want an iPhone. Let's say, like, theoretically, if an iPhone was available to me, I'd want it. But it's not something that exists. It only exists because a capitalist and with the profit incentives decided to create a company that created the iPhone. So I'm saying, like, how are these types of things coming about through such a system where you seem to be only having like the stable, like, commodity type goods being given out? Like, how are we getting to the place where we're advancing technologically with these labor vouchers?
Yeah, so, and again, like, I just want to be super clear. I'm not, like, advocating necessarily for labor vouchers. That's just, like, one way of doing it that's been proposed by Paul Cockshott. But So, like, the way that in a communist society, because I would like to sort of get away from, like, defending specifically Paul Cockshot's model and just defend, like, generally, like, the idea of communism. But I
Sure.
can answer that question, though, because your idea is, and I would think that, just so people know I'm not pivoting, like, I do think that you could justify you can, like, Paul Cockshot's model isn't the only way of, like, getting people or communicating consumer demand. I think, like, Michael Albert's idea of, like, consumer councils would allow us to communicate consumer demand just as well as Cockshot's model and just as well as any market economy. So I'm just throwing that in there because I don't want people to think that, like, I use Cockshot's model when it's convenient and then I run away from it or whatever. But yeah, so when it comes to generally how will innovation happen under communism, because people might want things that don't necessarily exist yet. So I think that fundamentally, if you want to create something, then it would be, all you have to do in a communist society is you get together with some other people and you say, hey, let's produce this thing, right? Because communism would be, in my vision, a bottom up and democratic form of organization. So it would just require you getting along with some other people democratically deciding, hey, let's start producing this thing. I think it would be cool. And as far as whether or not this could still facilitate technological innovation without a profit motive, I think that the evidence would suggest yes. I'm not sure how many of my debates you've watched, but there's the study I like to bring up a lot when people make this point. It's a super convenient, I guess, for me to use rhetorically. It's a Harvard Business Review study, and it essentially, the header of the study literally says people don't need a profit motive to innovate. And what the study says when you read it is that it's been found that in many parts of the economy, innovations which are done for free by people who just give them away are increasingly competing with for-profit, patent-protected innovations. And this is happening all across the economy. So even under capitalism, where the profit motive is the motive which is emphasized at the expense of other motives are outdoing the profit motive when it comes to driving people to innovate. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Okay, I'm skeptical. I agree that, like, profit motive isn't the only thing you need to innovate.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the 2 points. I think it's a major thing. There's going to be less innovation without a profit motive. And two, let's like go back to the Apple example, right? So yeah, you get a group of guys who think it's a great idea to have an iPhone, but what in a capitalist system, what you need to convince people that this is going to be the type of thing people are going to want to buy, and from there they'll be willing to give you capital for equity because they'll eventually be able to get their money back and get a return on their investment,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But here, where are you getting your money from? And two, like, Apple depends very heavily, probably too much, and it's unethical, but on the labor of people in developing countries to work 15-hour days for very low wage, doing very menial tasks. That's the only way we're able to get all these iPhones. I see no way we're going to be able to get in a communist system thousands of people willing to devote day after day doing menial tasks to create this iPhone for these people. And I don't see where they're getting the money either. Everybody can have an idea, but to get the capital to spend that idea in capitalism, you need to be able to convince people that you'll be able to create value. In your system, who are you convincing to get this money and to get people to, well, there's no money even, to convince you to get people to work for you? And who are the workers going to be doing these menial tasks?
Yeah, so when it comes to how do you get the resources, in general, people are always going to have resources at their disposal. I would argue significantly more resources at their disposal just personally than they have under capitalism, because obviously under communism, the wealth that's created by society is distributed to every member of society, like, equally, more or less, whereas under capitalism, it's distributed mostly to a very small group of capitalists at the top, which is why we have such absurd levels of income inequality, which I know you would agree with. So I'm not, like, arguing that's a con to your system, because I know you're a social democrat. But so first of all, people are always going to have a lot of resources at their own disposal. Second of all, the means of production generally, like the commanding heights of the economy or whatever, are going to be owned democratically by, the community, by by the community. So it's like, if you wanted to get like additional resources to say produce iPhones, you would have to, just consult the community. And if the people in the community said, yeah, we do want to start producing this, that sounds like a good idea, they would just, democratically decide to provide those resources, I imagine. I don't like, again, I just want to give the disclaimer, like, I don't like getting super into the details of how exactly things would work under communism. I'm sure any guess I can give you is going to be wrong. I'm just sort of giving an idea of how it might look to prove the point that people saying that X thing wouldn't work under communism isn't necessarily the case. But yeah, that's what I would say to that. And I think as far as your other point, which was like, you made a point about what was the point that you made about I think
boring, hardworking jobs.
Oh yeah, it was, yeah, who would do the jobs that nobody likes to do. I mean, it's hard for me to say. I could think theoretically there would be, some sort of a rotation. So for example, Michael Albert, who I've referenced earlier, advocates a workplace model wherein there's like a balanced job complexes where people democratically basically decide that they each have a somewhat balanced ratio of like more empowering work and more like menial work. And so like each different person is going to have, their time divided, more or less equally. Some of the times they're doing like the harder, less fun jobs, and some of the times they're doing the more empowering work and so on. And that's just like one model that's been proposed, but yeah.
But yeah, if you're not gaining anything from working, why would you choose to do this rotation? Why wouldn't you choose to only do the fun jobs? Like, who's choosing to spend days working these menial jobs when you don't have to? Because you'll be having the same goods given to you, the same amount of resources you own, no matter what you do.
Well, because I imagine it would be decided like democratically by the people who work in the given unit. And so it would be in like the general interest of everybody to say, hey, let's come together and democratically decide that we're each going to do, some of the hard jobs some of the time, and then we're each going to do some of the, more empowering work, which is, less difficult and so on. So it would just be in the general interest of all the parties to do that, right?
I'm saying this is going to be a prisoner dilemma type problem where, yeah, it's in the incentive of everyone to have everyone else do it. And like, it's a better situation of everyone committing to working the menial job than nobody. But from an individual perspective, game theory would dictate that it wouldn't be worth it to commit to doing this. Like, you'll just assume everybody else will do it for you. Like, I don't think this would actually happen. But again, we're going into a level of detail that I know you don't actually care about, because like, you're willing to concede that this might be not the ideal system because you have lots of different options. You're just trying to show plausibility. So we don't need to go too much into it, but I don't think this was an example of plausibility, at least.
Okay. So I think, I mean, I could defend that like a little bit more, I guess. Like, I do think that when you have a scenario where like a lot of people are like, coming together in a democratic fashion to decide on something, if they all work together, or they're all in a house together, I generally think that humans are capable of like cooperating with other people in a group to create a situation where everybody is more or less benefiting from it, which I think is what, creating the sort of the balanced job complexes that Michael Albert talks about. I think that there's reason to believe that people would be able to do that. Because, obviously you can say like, well, what if someone just didn't want to do all the work? Or what if someone just chose like, hey, I want to do all the easy work? Well, it's like the other people in the workplace obviously wouldn't accept that, and they'd say, hey, we've agreed democratically that we're all going to, sort of balance our job complexes so that we all benefit from it, and, we're not going to allow you to mess that up. So, like, like I think that's generally how that would probably work. But like you said, this is a level of detail I don't really care about, because even if I were to say, yeah, this balanced job complex model isn't plausible, there's other ways of organizing it. But I don't think that fundamentally you need money to perform these functions, because I think there's a lot of other mechanisms which we can do it, which don't necessitate like markets or capitalism or anything.
Okay. Are you? I don't know what your time limit is or anything. Like, I can talk about this for 100 hours. I just find it very interesting to talk about. But
Yeah, I should probably get going soon. We've I didn't even realize we've been talking for like 2 hours and 20 minutes, and I should probably eat soon. So
yeah, I haven't eaten lunch yet.
yeah, me either.
But so yeah, like, I've enjoyed this a lot. Actually, I feel like I've learned a lot and had to think about a lot of different things. I think, like, one thing about this discussion was, like, we're a bit all over the place just because it's such a huge topic
Mm-hmm.
that, like, there's so many different, like, arguments and sub-arguments and sub-sub-arguments to get to actually, like, convince one side or convince the other side.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, I still found it productive though. I think,
Mm-hmm.
like, in the future, if we were to talk again, I think, like, it might make sense to, like, focus on one specific issue of communism and,
Yeah,
like, argue that one point the whole time.
yeah, for
I think
sure.
that just might be more productive. But I enjoyed this a lot. Yeah, I don't know. I can make, like, a closing, like, argument, or do you want to do that?
Yeah, yeah. I would just, I guess, extend the courtesy. I also enjoyed having this conversation. I do think, like, I did end up getting into, like, a level of detail that, like, I usually don't like getting into. But, I guess sometimes it's necessary to prove that there are other ways of doing things. But yeah, I appreciated the conversation. I had fun. Yeah, if you want to make an opening argument, yeah, you can, go ahead and do that. If
Okay.
not, that's fine too. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, I never made an opening argument, so I guess I'll do that one now.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I guess one of my takeaways from this is that I think it's a lot easier to, like, attack a system that's, like, in place and they're, like, empirical things you can look at about it than it is to attack a system that, like, is very fluid in nature, and that, like, communism, your form of communism, you're not sure about the details yet. You just know it's a place you want to get.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult to argue against something where any point you make against it, you can just bring a counterpoint of, no, I want it to be a bit different, like, this way. I think that's been one of, like, the only things that's, like, annoyed me about this conversation a bit. Like, it's kind of difficult to get down into any point where I can conclusively show why it wouldn't work. And I think that's inherent to the fact that there is no conclusive way to show something that hasn't been tried and the way you want it tried could work,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just impossible to prove it until we try it.
Yeah.
So I think what it ultimately comes down to is, like, whether this is something we should worth fighting towards and to try another time. And that's something I'll have to think more about. And then there's a lot of tons of other arguments I have to think more about. But ultimately, I'm still on the side of that. I'm not convinced that we can have an efficient economy, or as a productive economy, where enough wealth is produced in communism that would outweigh the benefits, where there clearly are benefits you've outlaid. I just haven't been convinced they outweigh the flaws that I perceive would be very likely.
Yeah, I think that's all completely fair. I guess the one thing that I would say is, like, I understand being annoyed, because, you can say, like, well, I think this would be bad, and then I'll say, like, yeah, but communism doesn't necessarily have to have that. I get being annoyed by that, but on the other hand, I think it's sort of fair, because, like, if your objection to communism is a certain model of communism, then that's not an argument against communism per se, because you can just say, then we don't have to use that model. And, I think it is possible to, prove that communism would be bad or that it couldn't work. I think you can make an argument for that, even though it's never existed. And you can do that by, as I said earlier, bringing up things like that communism gets rid of, for example, markets and money and the hierarchical organization of the enterprise. You can point to one of those things or any of those things and say, hey, if you get rid of this thing, it's going to be harmful. That's sort of like what the calculation argument is, for example, which, obviously I have my own response to that. But yeah, like economists for a very long time have tried to argue that, like, you have to have money, and if you get rid of money, which communism does, then that's going to be harmful to society. And obviously I couldn't respond to that by being like, well, communism's fluid, because if the argument is that, you have to have money and communism explicitly doesn't have money, then there's no way, no matter what model you propose, for communism to be successful. So I think it is possible to argue that. But yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I would just say, like, in my closing statement, I do think that capitalism births a lot of negative externalities, which I think we have no reason to believe communism would also birth. And I haven't heard yet in my entire life a convincing case, obviously not, or I wouldn't still be a communist, but I haven't yet heard a convincing case that there are any specific things about communism or that necessarily incur negative utility to an extent that overrides the negative utility that we see the mechanisms of capitalism reproducing. So yeah, I guess that's all I would say. But yeah, I appreciated the conversation. Yeah, thanks for chatting with me.
Thanks so much for giving me some of your time as well.
Yep, no problem. All right, you have a good day, bud.
You too.
All right, see ya.